My name is Stuart Dunnings III. I'm the Ingham County Prosecutor. On December 8 of last year, Lansing Township Police had an officer-involved shooting during an incident that arose at a traffic stop. The shooting was a fatality, and the deceased was the late Mr. Randall Minier. Following this incident, the Michigan State Police began a thorough and independent investigation of this matter. The investigation was led by First Lieutenant Sean Furlong. Their report and accompanying evidentiary materials were submitted to this office, and I have now reviewed these documents and materials. Their investigation involved extensive interviews with eyewitnesses, as well as review and analysis of multiple audio-visual recordings produced by police and private citizen sources. Here is a synopsis of what we know about this incident. An officer of the Lansing Township Police Department made a traffic stop on a vehicle based on a possible speeding violation. The traffic stop occurred on West Kalamazoo Street. Shortly thereafter, a second officer responded as backup. There were three occupants of the stopped vehicle: Tyrell Washington, the driver, his brother Tommy Washington, the front seat passenger, and Randall Minier Jr., the back seat passenger. When the vehicle was stopped, according to the driver, Mr. Minier became antsy and said for them to make room so he could run. This surprised both driver and passenger, as they were unaware of any reason to run from the police. As the second officer approached the vehicle, that officer witnessed the back seat passenger in possession of a gun. This passenger was Mr. Minier. The officer yelled, "Gun," and both officers gave repeated commands for that person to drop the gun. Instead, Mr. Minier continued to display the gun in the air. Following this, the officer gave repeated commands to drop the gun, all of which were ignored by Mr. Minier. The driver and the passenger immediately complied with the officer's commands and displayed empty hands. The front seat passenger exited the vehicle hands up and moved from the car. Mr. Minier did not drop the gun, and the officer fired his gun. We know from the autopsy report that Mr. Minier was facing the officer at the time of the shooting. One of the two men in the car, Mr. Tyrell Washington, stated that the deceased, Mr. Minier, quote, had the gun in a raised position toward the passenger right side of the vehicle. He later demonstrated the gun being raised and displayed in a back and forth motion to the right and left. Tyrell described Randall's actions as more of a scare, pointing and a means to let the officers know that he had a gun and for them to get back. That's a quote from the Michigan State Police incident report. It is clear from the audio recording that the officers are giving clear vocal commands to the three men in the car. The front seat driver complied. The front seat passenger complied. Mr. Minier did not and never relinquished his weapon. Given this scenario, the officers had legal authority to use their weapons. Once Mr. Minier displayed the gun, he was subject to arrest. Furthermore, once the officers established his identity, Mr. Minier would have been subject to arrest for an outstanding warrant. It is axiomatic that, quote, the police have the right to use force reasonable under the circumstances to effect an arrest. The police may also take what action is reasonable to protect themselves in the course of an arrest or an attempted arrest. That's a statement from the law from the case of Dunnings versus Saka, 391 Mich. 296. Given these facts, I believe that in the face of an armed threat, the officer in question acted reasonably. I believe the officer used proper restraint in giving Mr. Minier time to drop the weapon, and also in giving time for the front seat passenger to exit the vehicle and to position himself, speaking of the officer, so that the driver was not in the line of fire. I'd like to show you a couple of